The day of the wedding was flawless. The hot June sun shone down on the old Victorian mansion that had become the perfect setting for the celebration. The garden around the house was drenched in flowers and ribbons shimmering in the morning light. At the center of this serene picture were Anne and David Green, a couple whose love story seemed to everyone to be a model of sincere affection. It seemed so because behind the outward perfection lurked the shadow of impending tragedy. Anne was the embodiment of grace, swarthy, with fine features inherited from African ancestors. She moved with a special ease which mesmerized others. Her deep, calm gaze concealed a secret known only to herself and her older sister Evelyn. In those dark eyes read a story that no one present could understand or accept. Beside her stood David, a tall, athletic man with the piercing gaze of a man accustomed to pursuing the truth. His years as a lawyer had honed his sense of justice to an impeccable sharpness. His integrity commanded respect from some and wariness from others. In recent weeks, he had increasingly caught himself that there was a reticence in his relationship with Anne. He kept this anxiety carefully hidden, not wanting to darken the pre-wedding days, but his keen gaze as he watched the bride surreptitiously gave away the growing anxiety. Evelyn, who had come to help her sister with the last preparations, kept close to Anne like a faithful guardian. It wasn't just kinship that bound them together. Evelyn was the keeper of a secret that could ruin everything in an instant. Every now and then she cast anxious glances at her sister, as if she sensed an impending storm. David's attempts to approach Anne to talk to her caused her a subtle tension, as if there was an invisible struggle going on inside her. She greeted him with a smile, but that smile only added to his vague suspicions. He tried to focus on the upcoming ceremony, on his vows, on the future they had planned together. But memory was obligingly tossing up details that now seemed too strange to be coincidental. The passport story was just one of many. Every time the documents were demanded, Anne found a graceful way to evade, citing forgetfulness, or the fact that the documents were stored with acquaintances. At first, these little things had seemed insignificant, but now they formed a disturbing mosaic. Her evasiveness when talking about the past, which he'd previously written off as natural restraint, was taking on new meaning. David, let's just enjoy the moment. Her favorite phrase now sounded like a warning. Not everything in life has to be explained. Ken, his best friend and witness at the wedding, noticed the tension gripping David. Walking over to him, he tried to diffuse the situation. "Nervous?" he asked with a smile, though there was a look of concern in his eyes. "It's not every day you get married, is it?" David tried to smile back, but the heaviness in his chest wouldn't let go. "Yes, brother." He looked away, but something is wrong here. I can't explain it. Ken raised his eyebrows in surprise. "She is your chosen one, David. Anne is an amazing woman. Maybe you're just worried like everyone else." His voice sounded soothing. "Maybe there's no mystery." But David's inner voice screamed otherwise. As he watched Anne embrace her sister, he noticed something in her gaze that made his heart ache. Behind the flawless exterior lurked another Anne, one he may never have truly known. Throughout the day, Anne disappeared into the back of the house several times, as if trying to hide from the hustle and bustle. Each time David tried to find her, she proved elusive. This alarmed him more and more, but he held himself back, repeating that today was their special day, the day that would be the beginning of a new life. Though an inner voice whispered that it could be the end of everything he believed in. At the wedding archway, friends and family gathered. Anne's friends, mostly her colleagues from the local school where she taught, whispered among themselves, discussing her good fortune. A man like David was a rarity in their small town. They noticed her nervousness, but wrote it off as normal pre-wedding excitement, unaware of the depth of what was going on. Sarah Green, David's mother, approached her son as he exchanged brief phrases with friends. A tall, reserved woman with a shrewd eye, she had inherited the same keen intuition as her son. Noticing his tension, she asked quietly, "Are you all right, David? You seem too focused." He nodded, trying to appear calm, but his gaze flickered involuntarily back to Anne, who seemed to be deliberately avoiding meeting his eyes. "Mom," he replied, trying to hide the storm of emotion. "I just want everything to go perfectly." Sarah scrutinized her son's face as if trying to read his thoughts, but she didn't press. She only squeezed his hand gently and said, "I'm sure you'll have a wonderful marriage." Her warm smile as if trying to dispel his doubts. "Your future wife is a real find, David. You've always been looking for a woman like this." David remained silent, sensing the bitter irony in his mother's words. If she only knew how much of a find Anne might turn out to be. After the gala dinner, when the guests had gone to their rooms in the country mansion, David was alone in the spacious living room. The silence pressed upon him, forcing him to recall moments that had seemed insignificant before. Now they formed a disturbing picture, like pieces of a puzzle he'd refused to put together for too long. There had always been more to Anne's aloofness than just natural reticence. She had built an invisible wall around herself, and at first it had fascinated him, a mysterious woman keeping her secrets. But now, standing in front of a tall Victorian mirror, he saw in his reflection a man who might have fallen in love with an elaborate illusion. The hospital incident now seemed particularly telling. When he'd offered to accompany her for a routine checkup, Anne had reacted with unaccustomed abruptness, insisting she preferred to go alone. "Just lady stuff, honey," she had said then, and he had accepted that explanation. But the same situation happened again and again, as if the very thought of his presence in a medical facility caused her to panic. He paced the room, peering into the darkness outside the windows, as if the answer to his questions might be found there. The love and trust that had been the foundation of their relationship was now a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest whiff of truth. The next morning, after breakfast, he ran into Evelyn. Sister Anne looked at him as if she read his mind, as if she knew his every doubt. "David," she said, putting her hand on his shoulder. Her eyes read worry. "You still love her, don't you?" His gaze softened for a moment. Of course he loved Anne. Her charm, her depth, that special aura she possessed, all of it had captured him from the first time he'd met her. But now those qualities seemed part of a larger deception. "Yes," he answered briefly, averting his gaze. "But I need to understand her. There's so much she doesn't tell me." Evelyn froze, as if solving a difficult problem to herself. Her hand on David's shoulder trembled slightly, and for a moment he thought she was ready to reveal some important secret. But instead she uttered, "Anne has always been like that. Secrets. It's part of her life. I know it's hard, but she loves you, David." Those words should have reassured him, but achieved the opposite effect. Secrets? The very admission of their existence from the person who knew Anne best only heightened his anxiety. He needed the truth, not for the sake of mere reassurance, but for the sake of understanding who the person he was about to commit his life to really was. That evening, he found Anne in the guest room. She was sitting on the wide windowsill, looking out over the garden flooded with the last rays of the setting sun. In this illumination, she seemed especially beautiful and unattainable. "Anne," he began, slowly approaching. "Do you trust me?" She flinched, but quickly pulled herself together. Her face took on its usual calm expression, like the mask she wore so skillfully. "Of course you do, David. Why do you ask?" She answered softly, but there was a faint note of strain in her voice. "I don't think we're frank enough with each other," he said, trying to speak evenly. "For example, you never talk about the past, about the things that really matter to you." Anne averted her gaze. Her face remained serene, but the hands she had around her knees trembled slightly. She clenched her fingers together as if trying to cope with the excitement, then tried to smile, but the smile came out strained. "We all have a past," she finally said quietly. "Maybe it's just hard for me to talk about it." This next evasive phrase only made him more anxious. He scrutinized her face, trying to find a glimmer of sincerity, but saw only the familiar mask of detachment. She was evading again, and now he was sure she was doing it deliberately. Why? What could be so important as to hide it, even from the person you were about to share your life with? Back in his room, David spent a sleepless night analyzing their conversation. Every detail, every gesture now added up to a disturbing picture. Anne wasn't just hiding something. She seemed to be living a double life, and with each passing hour he felt more and more acutely that she had something to lose. Memory obligingly threw up new details. That dinner with friends when his coworker had asked where Anne had gone to school. She'd answered vaguely, almost immediately turning the conversation to another topic. At the time, he'd written it off as her modesty, but now he saw the episode differently, as part of a deliberate strategy to avoid any talk of the past. Ken, always sensitive to his friend's moods, had noticed his condition during his morning walk. He approached David as he stood at the edge of the terrace, looking nowhere. "David, you've been on edge from the start," he said bluntly. "Did something happen? You look like you're questioning your decision." David paused, realizing he couldn't hold it all in any longer. "I don't know, brother," he finally exhaled. "Anne, she's too closed off. She doesn't say anything about her past, and the more I pay attention to it, the weirder it all seems to me." Ken nodded understandingly, choosing his words. "We're all hiding something, David. Maybe it's just part of her defenses. Maybe it's hard for her to open up." But those words sounded like an excuse that no longer worked. David needed more than the comfort of a friend. He needed the truth, whatever it turned out to be. And something told him that truth would change everything. David nervously adjusted his tie as he watched Anne charm the guests with her smile as they rehearsed the ceremony. For the past few weeks, he'd had a strange feeling that there was something wrong behind the perfect facade of their relationship. Every time he tried to talk about her past, she deftly avoided answering, leaving behind a trail of unspoken words and a light Chanel fragrance. On the spacious terrace of the mansion where the ceremony was to take place, workers were finishing the pyrotechnic installation. The massive structure, camouflaged with white ribbons and flowers, was to be the climax of the evening, a grand fireworks display blooming just above the heads of the newlyweds during their first kiss. David was absent-mindedly watching the technicians check the fixtures and wires when he noticed that Anne had stepped away to talk to the florist about the finishing touches to the wedding arch. The opportunity to test his suspicions came out of the blue. The bride's room was empty, and Anne's elegant purse lay on the dressing table as if inviting a peek inside. David hesitated only a second. 2 years of relationship gave him the right to know the truth. The contents of the purse were ordinary: cosmetic bag, phone, documents. A passport in a burgundy cover seemed perfectly innocent until he opened it. Anthony James, in black and white. Gender, male. The photo was old, but the facial features were unmistakably recognizable. The room swirled before his eyes. David collapsed into his chair, feeling nausea coming up to his throat. 2 years. 2 years he'd lived a lie, fallen in love with an illusion, was about to commit his life to... with who? Memories flashed through his mind, forming a new picture. Her reluctance to swim in the pool, her refusal to introduce him to her parents, her strange reaction to old photos, her peculiar grace that seemed so feminine. "You're an idiot!" My temples throbbed. "What an idiot you are!" The ceremony began at 5 o'clock, when the sun was already beginning to sink, coloring the sky in soft pink tones. The guests were seated on white chairs, arranged in a semicircle on the terrace. The pyrotechnic installation, now completely hidden by floral arrangements, waited for its time. The technician nervously checked the control panel. Something in the system was not working properly, but there was no time for a full diagnostic. Anne appeared to the sound of the wedding march, and a sigh of admiration ran through the rows. The white dress flowed down her figure, emphasizing every movement. She was beautiful, and that made David even more nauseous. "Dear friends and family," the official began solemnly, "we are gathered here today." "No." David's voice sounded like a whiplash. "Before we continue this farce, I want to make something clear." Anne froze, her fingers clutching the bouquet convulsively. "David?" Her voice trembled. "What are you—" "I think it's only fair for everyone to know who you really are." He pulled out his passport. Anthony. The name sounded like a slap in the face. A shocked whisper rippled through the rows of guests. "David, please." Anne took a step toward him, her face turning white. "Let's talk in private." "Alone? Like we've been talking for the last 2 years?" His voice trailed off into a scream. "How many more lies do you have in store for me? Or should I say saved? What's the proper way to address you, huh, Anthony?" At that moment, something clicked in the pyrotechnics. The first firework exploded into the air with a deafening whoosh, scattering directly over the heads of the guests. It was followed by a second, a third. The system was out of control, setting off charges in a chaotic pattern. "Oh my God!" someone shouted. "They're coming right at us!" The guests started jumping up from their seats, trying to get away from the falling sparks. A technician was desperately trying to reach the control panel through the crowd of panicked people. "I loved you!" Anne shouted through the roar of the explosions. Tears streamed down her cheeks, smearing her mascara. "Everything between us is real!" "Real?" David laughed bitterly, his face contorted with rage. "You stole 2 years of my life, made me believe, made me love you." He gasped with rage. "You monster!" Another firework exploded above their heads, showering the terrace with a golden rain of sparks. The guests screamed, scattering. Some were trying to make their way to the stairs leading downstairs. Some were calling for help. "David!" Anne backed away, her heels clinging to the hem of her dress. "Please, let's just—" A new series of explosions drowned out her words. Smoke from the fireworks filled the terrace, making it difficult to see. David lost sight of her for a second, and when the smoke cleared a little, Anne was gone. Only a scream, almost inaudible over the rumble of pyrotechnics and the sound of impact below. As the panic subsided and the smoke cleared, the guests cautiously began to rise from the ground and return to the terrace. The white dress lay in a crumpled heap on the stone slabs below. Red stains blurred on the silk, mingling with rose petals scattered by the wind from overturned vases. "Jesus," David's mother whispered, clutching at her heart. "What happened here?" "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted. "There's no pulse," the doctor, who was among the guests, said quietly, kneeling down. David stood at the railing, staring down with glassy eyes. His hands were trembling. His tie was off to the side. His white shirt was stained dark with the stains of nearby exploded fireworks. "She just disappeared in the smoke," he mumbled. "I didn't see anything," but something in his voice, in the way he avoided looking down, made several of the guests exchange worried glances, especially those who had heard his furious words minutes earlier. The wedding arch, scorched by the sparks of fireworks, swayed slowly in the wind. White ribbons, blackened at the edges, fluttered like mourning flags. Somewhere in the distance, the howling sirens of approaching police could already be heard. The foggy morning after the tragedy shrouded the Victorian mansion in a gray veil. Detective James Harris, who arrived on the scene at first light, stopped at the foot of the terrace, where forensic experts were already working on collecting evidence. The white wedding dress was gone, leaving behind only a chalky outline on the stone slabs. The summer idyll had turned into a crime scene, or an accident that was yet to be determined. "What have we got?" Harris asked his partner, Detective Sarah Taylor, who was studying notes in a notebook. "Victim is Anne James, 32 years old, fiancée," she began, fixing a disheveled strand of dark hair. "Fell from a height of about 6 meters during a wedding ceremony. Death was instantaneous. But there's an interesting point. A passport in the name of Anthony James was found in her purse." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "According to witnesses, the groom, David Green, made a public scene right during the ceremony, exposing his identity. Immediately afterward, there was an incident involving fireworks. Panic ensued, and in the commotion, Anne ended up dead." Harris walked slowly up the terrace steps, surveying the scene. The pyrotechnic setup still stood there, a massive structure, now charred and mangled. White ribbons and flowers, blackened by sparks, dangled like mourning garlands. "Where's the groom?" "In the house in Officer Reynolds' care. He's in a state of shock." The first witness was Evelyn, the sister of the deceased. She sat in the mansion's library, clutching a cup of untouched tea in her hands. Her dark eyes, so similar to her sister's, were red with tears. "Tell me about your sister," Detective Taylor began softly. Evelyn was silent for a long time, staring into the void. "Anne was special. She went through so much to be herself. Every day was a fight for the right to just be happy." "When did she meet David?" 2 years ago. He seemed perfect. A successful lawyer, caring, attentive. Anne fell in love with him almost immediately. But she was afraid to tell him the truth. About her being a man? Evelyn flinched at those words. Anne was always a woman. Inside. The body wasn't right, It took her years to correct that mistake of nature. And when it was finally right, David came along. At the other end of the house, Detective Harris was questioning Ken, the groom's best friend. Unlike most of the guests who had already left the mansion, Ken had stayed. Out of loyalty to his friend or out of guilt, it remained to be seen. David hadn't been himself the last few days, Ken recounted, tapping his fingers nervously on the arm of his chair. He felt like something was wrong, constantly talking about the oddities in Anne's behavior, how she was avoiding certain topics. And what was your advice to him? I told him he was getting himself worked up. God, if I'd known. Maybe I should have backed up his suspicions. Harris scrutinized the testimony of the technicians in charge of the fireworks. According to their report, the system had failed because of a faulty connection. The wiring was faulty, the chief pyrotechnician claimed, still pale after the incident. But I swear it was fine this morning. Someone must have tampered with the system later. Taylor joined Harris, holding up the new testimony. 3 witnesses confirmed David's aggressive behavior during the ceremony. He was yelling, waving his passport. One of the bridesmaids claims she saw him move toward Anne before the fireworks started. And what does David himself say? They found him in his study, a tall man with a glassy stare who seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. His hands, clutching the armrests of his chair, trembled slightly. "Mr. Green," Harris began, "tell me, how did you learn the truth?" I found the passport in her purse." His voice sounded hoarse. "For 2 years. 2 years she lied to me. I should have known, should have noticed sooner." "And you decided to make a scene right at the ceremony?" I couldn't just keep my mouth shut. It was too," he stammered, running a hand over his face. "But I didn't want her dead. I swear I just wanted the truth." "What happened on the terrace?" "I don't remember exactly. Fireworks exploded, everyone was screaming. Smoke was everywhere. I heard her scream, but I didn't even see her fall. I swear I didn't push her." Taylor sat at a desk in a temporary office set up in one of the rooms of the mansion, laying out photos from the scene of the accident. One photo showed a pyrotechnic setup, a massive structure clearly in need of a professional tune-up. Another showed marks on the terrace railing, as if someone had frantically tried to grab onto it. "What do you think?" Harris asked, looking at the evidence board. "Everything points to David," Taylor said thoughtfully. "Motive, opportunity, witnesses to his violent behavior, plus his searching through his fiancée's things this morning. It shows premeditation of action. But something doesn't add up here. Look at the timeline." She pointed to the entries. 1645, start of ceremony. 1652, David interrupts the ceremony by showing his passport. 1654, fireworks problems begin. 1655, first screams and panic. 1656, the fall. "Too fast for an elaborate murder," Harris nodded. "And too many witnesses. What kind of lawyer would go for murder in front of 100 guests?" The CSI joined them with an update. Forensics showed signs of tampering on the fireworks control panel. Someone intentionally damaged the wiring. "A new twist," Harris muttered. "Who had access to the rig?" "The maintenance staff, the organizers, any of the guests during the rehearsal. The list is long." The interrogation of David's mother, Sarah Green, added new details. The elegant woman held herself with surprising dignity despite the tragedy. David hadn't been himself the last few weeks, she recounted, carefully blotting her eyes with a handkerchief. "I noticed his restlessness but wrote it off as pre-wedding excitement. Now I realize it was a mother's heart that sensed something wrong." "Were you aware of Anne's true identity?" No, of course not. I would have told my son, although..." She was silent for a moment. There was something about her that was elusive, some mystery in her eyes. I just couldn't figure out what it was. Harris looked over the readings of the other guests. The picture was contradictory. Some claimed to have seen David aggressively looming over Anne before the fireworks exploded. Others spoke of panic and chaos in which it was impossible to see anything. "Take a look at this." Taylor put the new photos in front of him. "The footprints on the terrace floor. You can see here that someone ran toward the edge. Looks like heel marks. Probably Anne trying to get away. From David? Or just from the situation? Imagine, your secret is revealed. Everything falls apart. Panic with fireworks ensues. The natural reaction is to run. In the evening, they questioned Evelyn again. She seemed exhausted, but more collected. Anne told me she was going to tell him the truth. After the wedding, she believed their love would be strong enough by then. She planned to explain everything on the wedding trip, Evelyn continued, her voice trembling. Said that there, away from everyone, David would be able to better understand, accept. God, if he'd only wait. Harris and Taylor worked late into the night on the case. The wall in their temporary office was hung with photos, documents, diagrams. In the center was Anne and David's engagement photo. They looked so happy. Look, Taylor pointed to a diagram of the terrace. The fireworks rig was located here. The first explosion occurred at this point, causing the guests to rush in the opposite direction. Anne was almost sandwiched between the panicking crowd and the edge of the terrace. And David? According to witnesses, he was standing here. She noted the dot on the diagram. Physically, he just couldn't have gotten to it through the crowd in those few seconds. Harris rubbed his chin thoughtfully. So either he planned everything in advance, including the malfunction of the fireworks, which is unlikely for a man of his profession and character, or it really was an accident. A tragic confluence of circumstances. His emotional breakdown, equipment malfunction, crowd panic. The new expert report confirmed it. The damage to the fireworks system was the result of improper installation, not intentional tampering, just a fatal accident. But we should still arrest him, Taylor said. There's too much circumstantial evidence. Harris shook his head slowly. Not yet, no. There's something else we need to check first. Look at the timings again. Harris spread the paperwork out on the table. Who was the last person to check the fireworks system? When exactly did the first explosion start? There are discrepancies in the testimony. They called the chief pyrotechnician in for a second interrogation. A tired-looking man in uniform nervously rubbed his name tag. Michael Ross. I did a final check at 4:30 p.m. His voice sounded more confident than the first time. Everything was in working order. Then the ceremony began, and I stepped back to the control panel. The system was only supposed to go off after the vows were exchanged. But something went wrong, Taylor prodded. Yeah, it was like the rig turned itself on. I tried to get to the console, but panic set in. Harris studied the surveillance footage from the mansion's parking lot. Guests, security, staff. Everyone was moving through the normal rhythm of a wedding day. Nothing suspicious. You know what worries me the most? He said to Taylor. David's reaction after the fall. He didn't rush over to the body, didn't try to help, just stood there, up there. Shock, she replied. A classic reaction to a traumatic event, especially considering he'd experienced the collapse of all his ideas about his fiancée moments before. That evening, they spoke to David again. He sat in the same pose, still as lost, but now there was something new in his eyes, a deep, agonizing pain of understanding. I loved her, he said suddenly, without waiting for questions. You know what the worst part is? I loved her no matter what. Even when I found that damn passport, I wasn't furious about who she was. It was because of the lies. Harris watched him carefully. There was a sincerity in David's voice that was hard to fake. Why didn't you wait until the end of the ceremony? Taylor asked. Why did you have to make a scene right there? You don't understand. David ran a hand over his face. I couldn't say those vows, knowing it was all based on a lie. It would be a betrayal, and her betrayal too. I thought the truth would make everything right. Late that night, the detectives pieced all the information together. A new timeline appeared on the board. Look, Taylor pointed to the diagram. Only 4 minutes between exposure and the fall. Too little time for a premeditated murder, and too many witnesses. But enough time for a tragic accident, Harris nodded. A frightened woman who'd just lost everything. Panic, smoke, the crowd, the edge of the terrace. Here's the forensics report. Taylor placed a new folder on the table. The marks on the railing indicate that Anne was actually trying to hold on. Forensics believes she was backing up, probably trying to get away from the crowd or the smoke. The scratches on the metal are left by her rings, her wedding and engagement rings. Harris stood up, walked to the window. The terrace below was empty now, only yellow police tape fluttering in the wind. "We can press charges," he said slowly. "All the evidence points indirectly to David. His searching through her things, the public scandal, the aggressive behavior before the fall. The prosecutor will accept that. But we both know what really happened. This isn't a murder. It's a chain of events where every link led to tragedy. Anne's lies, David's suspicions, his emotional breakdown, the equipment malfunction, the panic of the crowd. It all came together to create the perfect storm." Taylor gathered photos from the scene. "You know what the saddest part is? If she'd just told him the truth sooner, or if he'd waited for a better time to talk, or if the fireworks hadn't gone off at that moment." Harris shook his head. "That's too many ifs. A story about how secrets and fear can ruin everything." A week after the tragedy, Detective Harris sat in his office rereading Evelyn's statement. After days of investigation, she had finally decided to tell her sister's full story. Her words on the record were adding up to a story that went far beyond mere deception. "Anthony realized who he really was as a teenager," Evelyn recounted. "Our parents, they couldn't accept it. When he turned 18, he left. Then 5 years later, Anne came back." Harris spread photographs on the table. Old shots of an angular, dark-skinned young man, and more recent ones of a graceful young woman with the same piercing gaze. "Those were tough years," he continued reading the testimony. "The surgeries, the hormone therapy, the constant fear of exposure. But Anne was happy. She was finally herself. She got a teaching job, started a new life, and then David came along." Taylor, sitting across the table, added a new document to the case. "The medical examiner's report confirms her story. All surgeries were done legally at a clinic in Switzerland. She underwent a full course of transformation." "Why didn't she tell David?" "Fear," came a voice from the door. Evelyn stood there, coming in for another interrogation. "She was afraid of losing him. It was getting harder every day to find the right moment to confess. And then he proposed. She loved him so much." Evelyn sank into her chair, her voice shaking. "Every time she tried to tell me, something stopped her. First it was fear of rejection, then it was fear of losing the happiness they had. And towards the end, by the end it was fear of destroying his world." Harris opened a new folder, the results of a technical examination of the fireworks rig. A detailed analysis revealed a series of fatal coincidences: an improperly installed fuse, overheating from a hot day, vibration from the music during the ceremony. All combined to create the conditions for a premature startup. "Take a look at this." Taylor spread out new photos from the scene. "We've reconstructed the exact position of all the guests at the time of the incident. David couldn't physically get to Anne. There was a whole group of people running from the sparks between them." "She retreated to the edge herself," Evelyn said quietly. "I saw her face the moment David showed her passport. It was the look of a man who had lost everything." On the table lay the envelope found in Anne's room, a letter to David that she had planned to give to him on their honeymoon. "Beloved," it began, "by the time you read this, we will already be husband and wife. I have a story to tell you, a story about how love can change a person, make them real." David was sitting in his office when the detectives brought him this letter. His hands trembled as he read the last words of the woman he loved. "I knew that sooner or later I would have to tell you the truth," Anne wrote. "Every day I woke up thinking that today I would find the strength. Every night I went to sleep feeling guilty for not saying anything, but I was so afraid to see the disgust in your eyes. I realize now, the silence was a bigger mistake than the truth." Harris watched David's reaction. The man in front of him no longer looked like the confident lawyer they had met at the beginning of the investigation. "I would have understood," David said suddenly, not lifting his eyes from the letter. "If she had told me herself, if she had confided, I loved her. Not her looks, not her body. I loved her soul, her laugh, the way she wrinkled her nose when she read, the way she sang in the shower thinking no one could hear." Taylor pulled the investigative report out of the folder. "Mr. Green, we're closing the case. All evidence points to an accident, a combination of faulty equipment, panic, and And my stupidity, David finished bitterly. I should have talked to her alone, should have given her a chance to explain herself. Instead, I arranged this. We all make mistakes, Taylor said softly. Sometimes their consequences are irreversible, but that doesn't make you a murderer. The epilogue of the case took up only a few lines in Harris's report. The dry facts: an accident caused by a combination of circumstances, technical failure, panic, accidental fall, case closed. But there was another story, a story of love and fear, of secrets and trust, a story of two people who loved each other, but let fear and prejudice come between them. A month later, David stood at Anne's grave. The stone was engraved simply, Anne James, beloved daughter and sister. I brought you roses, he said quietly. White ones, just like the ones that were on ours that day. You know, I've learned a lot in that time, about love, about acceptance, about what it means to truly know a person. The wind swayed the flowers on the grave, and somewhere in the distance the sun was setting, coloring the sky the same shades of pink as the day they'd first met. On the desk in David's office lay a photograph, him and Anne laughing, looking at each other. A moment of pure happiness, captured before secrets and fears ruined everything. Sometimes love is stronger than the truth, but we realize it too late.